right. Well, quite a few of you are already on. This is great. Thanks so much for joining. Well, we're really excited in all the interest that this webinar series has generated and thrilled that so many of you are tuning in. In light of our new digital world, this is a series highlighting local climate leaders working all around the Bay Area on a variety of issues relating to making our world a more resilient place. In case this is your first time joining us, Greenbelt Alliance is a nonprofit based here in the Bay Area, and our mission is to educate, advocate, and collaborate to make the Bay Area's lands and communities more resilient to a changing climate. Today, we're really lucky to be joined by Alexandria McBride, the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Oakland. Alex leads the citywide resilience building efforts with the goal of helping Oakland prepare for, withstand, and bounce back from the shocks of catastrophic events like earthquakes, fire, floods, and perhaps now pandemics. And also slow-moving disasters like sea level rise, homelessness, and economic inequality. Prior to this role, Alex served as the Director of Environment and Sustainability at the Information Technology Industry Council in Washington, D.C., where there she directed climate and product energy programs and activities based on the tech sector while developing and advocating for positions on domestic and international policies related to the product energy efficiency, clean and renewable energy, and climate. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today for our conversations with climate leaders. We're so happy you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Zoe. I've been a fan of you and Amanda, the Executive Director of Greenbelt, so just happy to be here.
Yeah, we go back, so it's fun to bring you back into Greenbelt after our work together on Resilient by Design.
Yeah, thank you.
How have you been?
That's a question that's a hard one to answer nowadays. But I'm healthy and have been, I think, in a way, despite how busy everything is, I've been really thankful to be working in the city under a mayor and city administrator, really trying to take on this pandemic as best possible, centering community needs. So it's been a lot of work, but it's also been inspiring and fulfilling, and we're trying to find the bright spots in what is a very tough time for many.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a terrible time, but it really has been inspiring to see how the community has come together and the different kind of ad hoc initiatives that have come out of such a terrible situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, it was March 13th that I was deployed to the Emergency Operations Center. The City of Oakland, with the Bay Area was one of the first areas to kind of recognize and, call this shelter in place. And it has been lots of lessons learned, but also, I think, again, our benefit to have some, leadership in our health department to make a call very early to shelter in place. And we've had a mayor and city administrator who have been so quick to respond to try to address needs very quickly. So that's, for me, looked like testing sites. For the first couple of months, I was helping with the community-based testing sites for COVID. And yeah, we're still obviously in the middle of it, but yeah, there's been a lot of work from a lot of my coworkers in the city and trying to meet this head on.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And I definitely want to hear all about, your response and your role in the Emergency Operations Center. But for those joining, I'm not sure everyone knows, what a Chief Resilience Officer is. So could you share a bit about pre-COVID and the before times, what your role was and what the type of projects you work on outside of your COVID life?
Great question, Zoe, and one that I get a lot. So the position Chief Resilience Officer was actually invented or kind of intuited by Rockefeller Foundation almost 7 or 8 years ago. After Hurricane Sandy in New York City, they realized that there wasn't really a sort of a higher level sort of person in city government thinking about not only the immediate moments after a disaster, but how can we prepare communities that are often not hit the same way. We all know that disasters don't hit different communities the same. For example, whether you are a person of color or with pre-existing conditions within the pandemic or someone dealing with economic insecurity, we know that we have to plan accordingly to prepare these communities. And that planning has to happen in what we call blue skies, right? Outside of a pandemic. So a lot of my work, I've been here for 2 years, was working with communities that we know for many reasons, including redlining, sort of structural racism, economic inequality. A lot of cities are dealing with certain communities that are burdened more than others. And I know a lot of the climate folks on here are also familiar with environmental justice. That's another measure of looking at what communities are experiencing bad air quality, for example, more than others. So I spent a lot of time here in Oakland, in East and West Oakland, working with community organizations that are planning, that are coming up with initiatives to help provide more access to different stakeholders. You mentioned resilient by design, and I'm really thankful for your leadership in East Oakland. We worked with multiple community organizations to come up with big ideas on how to, within a small area in what we call Deep East Oakland, come up with designs to deal with things like with sea level rise, which is a major issue. We have now wildfire, not only dealing with bad air quality days from wildfire, but also shutoffs of power that we're seeing with our public safety power shutoffs. So having those conversations in advance and in designing solutions can then help in times like we are right now in the middle of an emergency. We're able to respond in a more flexible way. One of the really good things I'm really proud of is that some of the work, the idea that we have my position, I work across departments. We were able to bring in a $28.2 million competitive grant from the state of California. It happens to also be focused in East Oakland and in partnership with the community, that brings in affordable housing, trees, a new bike share program. And what makes it different is it's not just, maybe more traditional top-down planning or cool ideas from my coworkers in the city. It's coordinated with and designed with the stakeholders in the community that would be, that are experiencing these benefits. So that's a little bit of the type of work that I was doing. And now I'm beginning to return back to, but in the last few months, it has looked a little bit different within the EOC.
Yeah, it's been so exciting to watch the Transformative Climate Communities grant process happen, and it's so incredible that you guys got it. It really seems like, the role of the Chief Resilience Officer to kind of like bridge the gaps and, bring the different organizations and silos together, is this an essential role, but nobody realized how critical it was going to be, or, how critical you were going to be in the middle of a pandemic. And so, I tuned in, I live in Oakland, and I tuned into a number of the city halls that you ran with the mayor. And, it really seems like she relied on you to play a key role in the, COVID emergency response. Can you talk a bit about in March, how what changed and, what role you played?
Yeah, and I also like to zero in. I come with a team. I have so many amazing.
I know it's not just you.
So it's not just me. I wouldn't be able to do it just by myself. But yeah, again, as we take on bigger and bigger issues, these issues don't land squarely within a department, right? It's not, climate change is not going to be handled by our Department of Public Works only, or our planning department. It's really, these big issues are forcing us to break down the way we're thinking. So the EOC, or the Emergency Operations Center, is a traditional structure that, it's even on a federal level, it's a very kind of specific way of an emergency management system, and it has its own kind of silos. There's a logistics unit, there's an operations unit where folks are coming in. So whether you're dealing with the Golden State Warriors parade or COVID-19, there's this EOC where everyone's in a room kind of thinking about how to respond and best support a major event. My role, again, because Oakland does things differently, was saying, well, hey, we don't have a unit that's, we called it community resilience, that's centering residents and small business needs, and having that be incorporated in how we're responding. How do we elevate those voices in the same room that, we have the fire department, the police department, and others kind of thinking about big issues. So my official title was Community Resilience Branch Chief, and that looked like going into the emergency operations center every day with the mission of obviously protecting and saving lives and ensuring that not only did we have folks suffering from the health benefits of the health issues from COVID, but also the economic impacts that people were at risk for, everything from inability to pay their rent to inability to shelter in place safely because they need to go to work and having access to food. So we really centered on the basic needs to ensure those communities that were already at risk were not just not forgotten, but also focused and prioritized during the pandemic. We also relied a lot on the mayor, who was an excellent fundraiser. She brought in almost $6 million in a few weeks from large foundations and even just individual donations from Oakland. And I helped to work with multiple stakeholders to try to use that investments to bring in small grants to small businesses, to run our COVID-19 testing sites, as well as build our our slow streets program, which we know folks became a fan of, which was helping closing down some streets to allow folks to shelter in place more safely.
Yeah, I live on one of those slow streets, so thank you very much for that.
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah, what sort of other initiatives came out of your department? Like you mentioned something about testing, or like what sorts of community-based products were there?
Yeah,
or are there?
If you may recall, early March, tests were very hard to find. And I mean, on a national level, there was a question about access to tests and ability to get the supplies in order to test. But with funding, we were able to partner with a Brown and Tolan physicians group who really stood up for the call. They're a private group, but wanted to kind of help with testing. And we built one of the first testing sites in the Bay Area, first for essential workers. Because of the limited supply, we were trying to follow CDC regulations, which was saying, well, hey, let's limit tests to essential workers. So that's, police, fire, others. And then we broadened it to a larger population to include what we can also consider essential workers, grocery store, folks who are working at grocery stores, obviously folks working in our hospitals and taking care of our children. So we, at peak, had about 4 sites. We tested almost 20,000 people since our first site opened in mid-March. What I'm most proud of, though, was our ability to continue to learn throughout. So we had our testing site at the Henry J. Kaiser Convention Center. We knew that some folks didn't feel like making appointments, that some people wanted to walk up instead of drive through, which most testing sites were you drove in. And that's when we worked with organizations like Roots Community Clinic that's still testing right now, that does walk-up testing without appointments every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I will plug to anyone on the line who's in Alameda County, who are looking for testing services, oaklandca.gov/testing is a resource, as well as the Alameda County Public Health Department website. But yes, we were really trying to be as thoughtful as possible about where we put a testing site, how we limit or remove barriers to testing. So to most, getting on your phone and making an appointment for a test is pretty simple. But if you're living in a place if you don't have a phone or have language access, we really wanted to try to break down as many barriers as possible. And again, our unit was all about thinking about how to make sure what we consider to be pretty easy, that we're not forgetting certain communities and certain challenges that others may have.
Yeah, I mean, testing is such a critical role in fighting this pandemic, and we could have a whole conversation about testing.
Yeah, I can geek out.
The lack of testing, but keeping it more on the resilience train here. I want to shift a little bit to think about how like Oakland and every other city like jumped into gear and made a lot of decisions and responded to the pandemic. And I think there's probably a lot of lessons to be learned from how the response to the pandemic that should also be applied to how we respond to climate change, or how we respond to the impending impacts of climate change, or how we like a climate disaster. Do you think we're prepared based upon our current response for like a big earthquake or a fire or something?
First, I love that question. And I think it is important to understand that disasters don't happen in silos either, and that we have to plan for what could potentially be multiple shocks, as we call them in our urban resilience language. So yeah, I think in this work you can't help but be optimistic, right? And if there is one hopeful element or silver lining I've seen, not just here in Oakland, but really across the nation, we've seen this social cohesion, which is actually, when we talk about resilience, that's actually an indicator for whether a community is more able to respond. It's, knowing your neighbors, knowing, how connecting and ensuring that you're supporting each other. So we've seen the social cohesion increase, whether that's clapping at 7 o'clock for your, for the health care workers, or what we've seen research in the amount of people that have lent food to their neighbors, or, seeing community, or with slow streets, being able to connect potentially in a way with your neighbors in a way you haven't before. So that cohesion, I think, has been, despite, it's interesting to see that cohesion increase, and despite our really inability to see each other with our masks on, et cetera, I think that has created something that is going to help us. And then in talking more infrastructure, we understand right now that we're thinking about wildfires, and we're thinking about potential PSPS, public safety power shutoffs, and trying to think through first what it looks like on bad air quality days, and ensuring that indoor air quality, where we were thinking about cleaning air centers where people could go and gather, like at a library or recreation center, to come together and breathe, in a place with air conditioning. We now know that that's not an option, so or not a safe option, or not as safe. So trying to think about what does it look like to help provide or increase indoor air quality where we can't have groups congregate. We're also obviously thinking about the public safety power. We know that, for example, there's a medically vulnerable population, folks who are they're dependent on their machines. And we've been able to, again, with the county, recognize or, identify those groups. So I think we are, based on the lessons learned in the EOC. I was back in the EOC and the PSPS as well. So based on those lessons learned, we're learning. And again, this community resilience branch, we didn't have that back in October when we declared an emergency for the public safety power shutoffs. And because of that, this pandemic, or this emergency with the pandemic, we added this element. So we as a city are constantly learning and trying to do better and respond equitably.
Interesting. So you can, leverage the unit that was created during the pandemic in order to, utilize it during the power shutoffs. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about, the role that social resilience plays in any disaster. And it's so important, but the role, it looks so different during COVID, because you have to socially distance while you're building social resilience. And it really has been, interesting to see how people navigate, like, making these social connections and relying on these neighbors in, really, innovative, sometimes digital or, distanced ways. But yeah, it's been really interesting to see. And, that's so great that you guys are, incorporating what you're learning about the wildfire. That's something that we've been thinking a lot about at Greenbelt Alliance, about how the impact of COVID will affect, the wildfire season coming up.
Yeah.
But,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
No, we knew we were going to get excited for this talk. We were both excited. Yeah. No, I mean, broadband too is another element. And I think we talked about that earlier, where when you're thinking about climate and broadband access, those don't necessarily go together. But because we are in a space where obviously people are dependent for education and distance learning, as well as their jobs, we have now as a city prioritized and really accelerated our broadband networks to help provide more equitable access to be able to connect in ways that we're now very reliant on.
Yeah, I mean, broadband is, no longer like a use, they're like a not important thing. Like, it's an essential piece of infrastructure that, is related to equity and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because if people can work from home, they, with stronger Wi-Fi, they actually might not need to come into the office. So it is interesting, the types of infrastructure that are valued more now as well.
Yeah. I also really kind of use this as a lesson learned when I think in the climate work, I've been in a lot of conversations about how urgent how urgent it is to come up with solutions on climate, and how that sometimes some people see that as a way to, or in conflict with the time it takes for that community building, or for that, for that input, real equitable access. I've seen some folks try to make those, to put those against each other. Like, we have to come up with a solution now, we got to move quick. But without that input and without that partnership, and again, the testing site, we're seeing the sustaining and nature of the Roots Community Clinic testing site, which was done and created in partnership with that organization, really, again, reminds us that yes, getting the thing out really quick is important, but even more important, if you have to design it, if you're designing for a community, you have to design it with the community. And the impact is so much more, or the impact is obviously more impactful if you take that moment, which to some in an emergency, taking that moment doesn't necessarily seem like the first thing to do. So it's something I reflect on a lot as we think about climate change, acknowledging obviously it is an urgent issue for the globe, but ensuring that we take that time to incorporate feedback is something.
Yeah,
that I think about a lot.
and if you take that time and build those relationships, you can then leverage them to deal with the wide variety of challenges that we're facing. Like, it sounds like you've been doing a lot of work in East Oakland and building those relationships, and then you were able to really jump into action when COVID hit. So I think it's really important.
Exactly.
Related to that, I know we all know that climate change is exacerbating injustices that frontline communities face, which is making climate adaptation, even more important. What do you see are some key equity challenges in Oakland?
Obviously housing, which has it's economic inequality in housing. The first thing I think though is, obviously we're in a city where we have a large amount of population that rents. And as we're dealing with an increasing unemployment rate, the risk of potential loss of housing in the city, and just general trends around displacement is something I think about a lot. So there's the keeping Oakland's rooted, where, and keeping and supporting the existing Oaklanders is, I think, I know a priority for the city. And it's exacerbated now in these moments. And then when you think about climate, and back to, climate and housing, a lot of these, and then redlining in history, you see that a lot of these communities that are already overburdened are in areas that also are more at risk for sea level rise, for example.
Absolutely.
So there's systemic meaty issues at play that I know will take and require more than just we're so excited about the grant, but that is that's not much when we think about the type of systemic change we need in areas like East Oakland. So I think about that housing, as well as just the economic inequality. I think when we're talking about climate, it can be so instantly brought into how do we reduce those greenhouse gas emissions? Give me the most effective route to get there, but we're not including sort of the equity impacts to that. It's why I want to highlight the work of our Equitable Climate Action Plan. It was just passed a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't read the report, I hope you all do. Again, it's called the Equitable Climate Action Plan, or ECAP. But we designed the plan to reduce greenhouse gas emission, but we centered an equitable approach. We even included a racial equity implementation component that essentially guides how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, with the overlay of the community, the frontline community. So that ties to more jobs, that ties to housing, it ties to things that we might not normally connect to our more, usual climate work. So I think about that, but again, I'm also hopeful with things like the ECAP that my colleagues have led and put together in partnership with the community, to provide a framework to getting there.
Yeah, and every city should have a climate action plan, but it's really incredible that Oakland actually has an equitable climate action plan. And I read through it. It's a great report.
Yay, thanks. Yeah, no, kudos to my colleagues Daniel and Shayna who worked on this for the last year and a half.
Yeah, so you've touched on like a couple of promising things that you're working on, but where do you see progress being made in your work or in your field, and what makes you hopeful given the state of the world?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to sort of, the work kind of similar to what you and Amanda were doing, having community members come together and through social ties and come up with plans and come up with ways to envision the change they'd like to see. So everything from the East Oakland, we've been talking a lot about that. In West Oakland, there's the West Oakland Community Action Plan that just got adopted back in December. This is a state, the state of California said, hey, we want air districts to partner with the communities that are struggling most with bad air quality. And we want you all to come up with a hyper-local plan to reduce, to essentially improve air quality and reduce disparities in air quality. And I want to call out the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, who led that work on behalf of the community. But we're seeing these, and that, again, the plan was adopted with about 70 actions to be implemented over the next 3 years. And it brings together not just the city, but the Port of Oakland, the California Department of Transportation, the many parties that have to come to the table in order to make that change. So I'm encouraged by, community members being the change they want to see. I know I work for a city. We obviously are committed to that, but I also have lived in a city, and I know that there can be blind spots, and I'm encouraged that we have such an active an active sort of citizenship here in Oakland that are really challenging the city and the other agencies here on how to best serve the community. So that's keeping me encouraged and keeping me busy too. But yeah, it's really cool to see it happening.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we have time for a couple of questions, I think, from the audience. If you have any questions, feel free to add them in the chat. There's a few questions in here. I think not every city is fortunate enough to have a chief resilience officer. And, I know the role that Rockefeller has previously played is no longer, they're no longer playing the same role. For the cities that don't have a chief resilience officer, what are like some skills that are useful for a chief resilience officer to play? Or, does a chief resilience officer play the same role in every city, or does it depend?
It definitely depends. And what's really great is, even though Rockefeller has just sort of changed the relationship, we have cities now just coming up with those positions with no connection to Rockefeller. My position is now funded by the City of Oakland and not Rockefeller. So yeah, we see cities, take it on in different ways. I think that at core, it has to challenge how local governments have worked in the past. So it has to be, I think, internally more collaborative and interdepartmental. It has to have that component. And then it also has to have this external component. Sometimes I feel like I'm a bit of a concierge to the city, to folks who are like, because the cities can be really bureaucratic, really confusing, to know that this department handles this and that is not natural, right, for an average person to know. So having that connection, not just bursting out silos internally, but also connecting community and finding ways to make the government more accessible. I think that's the role and the meat of the position, and that can take on so many different types of projects and initiatives, but that's what I would call it.
Yeah. And what's like one thing you would want the future climate leaders to know the most?
I would say that at the heart of saving the climate is supporting people. And I think it's so critical for us to zero in on that. I know this is a climate conversation, but I think we're all aware of the news in the past couple of weeks. For example, the census having the timeline now has been shortened. That impacts the amount of money we can bring into communities. That impacts our representation. I want to see climate leaders for social justice, and this census issue is an example. I think our work, as probably all of us know, is so interdisciplinary, and I challenge and love to see climate leaders thinking big picture about how this work affects your economic situation, your social situation. And yeah, so I would say think big and help us get the word out in the census. Volunteer if you can.
Yeah, definitely. Everybody should sign up for the census if they have not already or filled out their census form.
Yes,
All right,
please
one
do.
final question for you. How can organizations, like Greenbelt Alliance, for instance, help the City of Oakland meet your goals?
Whoa, that's a great question. I think one way is probably, calling when you see, for example, the ECAP. I'm so glad that you read that. If there are ways to support some of these goals, I think we have a really good, we're really ambitious and we like to set up challenges. We also have our racial equity indicators report, which sort of measures our progress as a city on racial indicators. It's not good like most other cities where there's a lot of work to do. I would challenge organizations to really zero in on some of the material we've produced, like the ECAP, like our racial equity indicators, like my Resilient Oakland Playbook. And if there's a specific or an area of concern or question, we love to, kind of interact. I speak on behalf of a lot of my colleagues who, get kind of cold emails or questions. The mayor also has a very open office. So giving her a call, the office a call or an email is usually a really great way to then get the emails passed to the right people in the city. And yeah, I think also maybe listen to a council meeting. I know they're long. I know they're pretty, but it's so
Well, now that it's on Zoom, it's so much easier.
I know, and it's such an informative experience. Now calling in and making a comment. I'd love to see how the council meetings have expanded through Zoom and having more people involved.
Yeah, it's been so inspiring to see how many people are now tuning into, the budget hearing and meetings that usually nobody would attend. So that's
Exactly.
definitely been an inspiring thing that's been happening.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are out of or past time. But yeah, this has been really great. I wish we could keep talking for a lot longer. I'd love to catch up with you later on. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Zoe, really. And please tune in next week. Marquita Price is a friend. She's going to that's the next round, I know, and I'm really excited about this series.
Yeah, next week we're going to talk more about the East Oakland work and talk a little bit more about the Transformative Climate Communities grant that Alex was mentioning this week. So yeah, it'll be a great time.
Yep, I'll be listening in.
Oh, great. I think Kita's on the line now too.
Cool.
And yeah, I look forward to seeing everyone next week. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.